Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organization for inviting me to speak. And I want to start out, give you a little bit of background on our organization. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight is to set the stage for what I'm going to talk about is President Ma last night made a very, very distinctive point of saying that part of Taiwan's future specifically is to become an innovation center for Greater China. And if we think about that, intellectual property protection is fundamental to that vision becoming a reality. So I want to start with that, and now I'm going to give you a little background around us. I'm the company up here that is not famous. I'm here with many other famous companies, but we're a very small, relatively new organization. But we have a huge mission. We're a not-for-profit organization that really focuses on improving intellectual property protection and reducing corruption in the global supply chain. That's our mission as an organization. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we do that in a minute and some of the tools that we offer to do that. And in developing what we have done in the last year, we've worked with a lot of multinational companies. We held a series of roundtables in the United States with over 120 companies. We worked closely with the Stanford Supply Chain Center and MIT's Supply Chain Center. And we did a large survey with the Conference Board to look at what are companies doing today to protect intellectual property inside their company, but also in their supply chain, and what are they doing to reduce corruption. If we look at these two issues, some people say, Craig, what is the link between these two issues? And what we see that's common is that they both are impacted by the weak rule of law and can be improved through better management systems inside a company. So just as Kurt mentioned, at several points, he used the word process related to supply chain. And what we believe is that companies need to use a process-based approach to try to tackle IP protection. If we look at the issues, one of the stats that is most interesting to me is the idea that in the US and globally, the surveys are showing that 75% of an organization's value is now tied to their intellectual property. 75% of their asset value. Trade secrets, trademarks, copyrights, patents. So when we talk about IP, we're talking about all of those areas. Trade secrets, copyrights, trademarks, and patents. The problems that we see are common to all. Every company has their own problem with it. And we see that counterfeiting is such a huge issue now, and a lot of people think about counterfeiting as the key. But a lot of the surveys that we do say that trade secrets are actually one of the biggest problems that are restricting international trade and investment. And again, if we look at Corning and their process for manufacturing glass, a lot of that is probably tied up in trade secrets. It's not patented technology. So trade secret protection is a key. On corruption, and I'm going to focus much more on IP today, but on corruption, it can add up to 25% of procurement cost in the supply chain. Huge cost. So as people are trying to squeeze cost out of the supply chain through very sophisticated data usage, through very sophisticated inventory management, one of the things they're ignoring is the cost of corruption in their supply chain. And finally, supply chain managers that we surveyed, 61% said they thought that corruption was the most significant risk, second only to product safety. So there's a willingness for people to identify this as a problem. People see these things as a problem. I work with a lot of multinationals, and I'll step back for a minute and give you a little bit of my background. I'm now the Chief Operating Officer for Create, but before that I had been involved in international trade and investment, having worked in 30 countries and first come to China and mainland China in 1989. And more recently, I've been working with multinationals on labor and environmental compliance in their global supply chain. I've written some books for the World Bank and the IFC on how do you implement management systems to improve labor and environment. And in doing that, one of the trends that we see is toward what I call holistic due diligence. And a lot of people, in some places, they're not sure of the word holistic, but what holistic means is looking at the whole picture. So if I'm evaluating a new supplier or business partner or value-added reseller, or in some cases, even a customer, I'm looking at their financial stability. Now I might look at their quality management, of course, is fundamental to how I would evaluate a supplier or a business partner. US and European companies look at labor compliance. I'm sure you've all dealt with that if you're a Taiwanese manufacturer, the labor audits, the environmental audits. But now what we hear is that they're also starting to look at intellectual property protection is a very, very important thing. Why? Because 75% of their asset value is tied up in IP. So as they realize the importance of it, and as they realize how poorly it's being handled and addressed, they're starting to put more emphasis on this. So what I want to talk to you about a little bit is some ways that you can start to address that. Number one is the idea of management systems. And if we look back 20, 30, 40 years ago, a lot of companies did not have quality management systems. And I gave a speech in India recently, and I was introduced by the head of Tata Group, is a large industrial group in India that some of you may have heard of before. And he had all the company heads from the Tata Group I was speaking to. And he said to them, he said, you know, 30 years ago, none of us had quality management systems. And when Tata Group first went to our companies and said, we need quality management, he said, many of you pushed back and said, this is silly. I know how to make my product. Why do I need to document it? Why do I need a system to implement this? And he said, but now, 30 years later, none of us would be in business if we didn't have quality management systems. The same is true in the future for IP protection. We've seen it with labor, the whole shift from more of an audit-focused now to more of a systems approach to try to improve it. And we think, especially Taiwan, is very well positioned to try to improve IP protection as a competitive advantage. So some of the lessons learned, and I didn't prepare a lot of slides, but one of the things I wanted to talk about here is the whole trend in international trade and the whole idea of supplier due diligence is toward companies are trying to push the responsibility into their supply chain. So if you're my business partner, I want you to develop systems to be good at quality control. I want you to develop systems to be good at labor compliance. I don't want to have to continue auditing that on a continual basis. So what's happened, we've seen in the labor side, is the audit focus has failed anyway. So after 10 years of labor compliance auditing, what we have largely is a billion-dollar auditing industry with some manufacturers being audited 50, 60 times a year for labor compliance, but very little actual improvement. And so the leading thinking now, Rick Locke, who's on our advisory board from MIT, is about to release a book saying that the key here is to use the audit only to collect data on what's taking place. But the key to improvement is management systems. And we think again to quality. It was quality management systems that drove a lot of improvement in many, many industries. Automotive industry, pharmaceutical industry. The idea of quality management systems is so fundamental to so many businesses today. And the challenge now is to take something that is not thought of as in a business process way, which is IP protection. Today, IP protection is largely housed in the legal department, in most cases, in the surveys that we've done, and the way that the lawyers handle it typically, and it's not a criticism, is that they sign a contract with their business partner or their supplier, and they put that contract in a drawer, and then if there's a problem with intellectual property, either theft or infringement, they pull the contract back out, and they say, what do we do now? Do we have legal recourse? Do we have civil recourse against them? What do we do? What we're saying, and what we see the trend starting toward, is to not be so reactive. We want companies to be more proactive, not only inside your company, but within your suppliers, within your end-to-end supply chain. Start to think about management systems as a tool to drive improvement. And the research that we did showed that these systems are lagging in companies. Even some of the very sophisticated multinationals do not have very good IP protection management systems. And there could always be exceptions, and I'm sure Corning has some excellent things in place. Maybe they have a holistic system, but maybe not. Maybe they have good pieces, but it's not tied together. I'll tell you a quick story about a small US company, because we've been surveying companies around the world and starting to work with them. So we were working with a very large Indian company that had tremendous systems in place at headquarters. But they had 12 development centers located in different parts of India and other parts of the world, and the systems were not being effectively transmitted from headquarters to the development centers. So from a headquarters standpoint, they thought everything is under control. But when you looked out at the development centers, the policies were there, but it wasn't being implemented. Because if we think about management systems, we always need to think about the system development, which is more of the documentation, but the system implementation. And it's the implementation that drives change. And implementation only comes about with trained, committed people routinely following the procedures. Having the procedures is not an effective management system. So the other side to that is I was dealing with a very small US manufacturer that makes very high precision parts and deals with patents from all of their customers. And I said to them, what is your IP protection program like? And they went through a self-assessment, and at first they rated themselves very high in a lot of categories. And I got on the phone with them and I said, let's talk about your IP protection program and your system. And we started to talk, and they said, well, you know, now that you mention it, I don't think we have anything. And I said, well, what do you do? And he said, well, when we get a drawing, we stamp it confidential. And I said, okay, great. Then what do you do next? And he said, well, I don't think we do much. And I said, well, you don't really have much of a system. And we talked a little bit. He said, let me get my quality management guy in here. So the quality management guy comes in, and they said, Dave, what do we do to protect the IP? And Dave said, well, if we have other customers coming, we try to hide the drawings from other customers so people can't see the drawings. And that was their system. So I said, do you have a quality management system? I said, you're making really high precision parts. You must have a good quality management system. And he went on for 10 minutes telling me about their great quality management system. Procedures, training, root cause analysis, on and on and on. I said, that's what you need for IP protection. And I said, because you are so familiar with this with quality, it's going to be easy for you to replicate this in IP protection. It's not a big deal. And immediately they wanted to do that. And then the next thing, I said, you know, if you do that, I think that becomes a competitive advantage for you as a company. And he said, you know, you're right. It really would, because our customers are getting more and more concerned with the idea of their IP through a host of reasons. It's more and more in the news. The US government is putting big initiatives in place to try to improve IP protection. We were actually cited by the Obama administration as an example of a kind of industry collaboration and industry best practice sharing that would be useful to US economic development and to that of our trade partners. So we get now to the point of what do we do? So I've talked to you a little bit about the idea of awareness. How do you create awareness? How do we get commitment for people to want to do this? And then how do you implement? That's always the challenge. So what we've developed is an online tool. It's a self-assessment that takes about 1 hour for a company to complete. They get a score in each of 8 categories on a scale of 1 to 5, a classic maturity matrix for any of you that are business process experts. Maturity matrix, scale of 1 to 5. Then we do an independent evaluation. So we talk to them on the phone and review some documents, and we give them a second score of 1 to 5. Those 2 pieces end what I would call the measure phase. But our mission is not to measure people. Our mission is to improve company performance. So our real focus is then on the improvement. And we have guides, e-learning, and a lot of other tools that are available to help companies. And I want to close just by saying that for those of you, I know we have a global audience here, but for those of you from Taiwan, I think that Taiwan is uniquely positioned to try to take advantage of improved IP protection. It fits into the economic vision of your president. It takes advantage of the research and development skills that your country is known for, and it takes advantage of the strength that you have in your quality management systems. So I encourage you to take advantage of that and to think forward and to think about IP protection systems as something that you would also do in the future. Thank you very much.
The line.